That's a podcast. Talk about it, think about it, discuss it. That's a podcast.
All right, let's dive into this research on anxiety and depression in Gen Z.
Okay.
You sent over some really fascinating stuff, and we're going to take a deep dive into Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation.
Yeah.
Have you read this one?
I have. It's really interesting. He's got this.
I'm about halfway through. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's eye-opening for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me was this analogy he uses. He compares Gen Z to like the first generation growing up on Mars.
Okay.
And it makes you think about just how radically different their environment is compared to the one that humans evolved in.
I can see that, yeah.
Yeah.
Like we would have physical challenge adapting to Mars,
Right.
With like the thin atmosphere and the lack of water, readily available water.
Right.
They're facing these psychological challenges of this world,
Yeah.
dominated by technology and social media.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know what's really compelling is he pinpoints these years between 2010 and 2015 as like this pivotal period. He calls it the great rewiring of childhood. And it's when teen depression and suicide rates just started to skyrocket.
Really?
And what's even more alarming is that this was happening across all races and social classes, not just isolated groups.
Wow.
Yeah, it's
So that's really alarming. And the fact that this was even before COVID, this surge
Yeah.
in mental health issues really makes you think about the root causes, right?
It does. The book kind of delves into the timing of this shift, and it debunks some common assumptions like economic downturns, for example, or like anxieties about global issues like climate change. And it really convincingly demonstrates that those don't explain the suddenness and the universality of these trends.
So if it's not just the economics or the climate anxiety, what is driving this great rewiring?
Well, this is where things get interesting. He explores this idea that children are naturally anti-fragile, and he uses this analogy of a tree that grows strong because it has to withstand the wind.
Okay.
So in the same way, children, they benefit from facing challenges and taking risks, but there's been this decline in those opportunities.
Yeah.
Which brings us to this concept of the disappearance of free play.
That makes sense. I mean, children need that unstructured time to play, experiment, even to fail.
Right.
That's how they develop resilience and learn to navigate the world, right?
Absolutely. And he cites a ton of research to support this, including the work of Peter Gray, who's really a leading voice in the field of play. You know, free play is where children develop these essential skills like social interaction, problem solving, creativity.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, you know, over the past few decades, free play has been steadily declining.
I remember reading about the changes in playground design
Yes.
from the book. You know, those old school playgrounds with the tall monkey bars and those spinny things that would make you so dizzy.
Right, right.
You know, it's almost like they were designed for risk taking.
Yeah, figure 3.4 in the book shows a great example of one of those old playgrounds.
Okay.
And then you compare that to like modern playgrounds, which tend to be a lot more, well, sanitized. It's really a reflection of this trend toward what he calls concerted cultivation parenting.
Oh, yeah. The idea that parents need to constantly supervise and orchestrate their children's lives, leaving little room for unstructured play.
Exactly.
Like every activity has to have a purpose, right?
Yeah, and this overprotective parenting style, this is driven by safetyism. It's really limiting children's opportunities to develop that natural anti-fragility we were talking about.
I remember he shared a statistic from a 2015 Pew study that most parents don't think kids should be unsupervised in a park until they're 14 years old.
Wow.
14, I was roaming all over the place long before that age.
It's a far cry from how previous generations grew up, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and this decline in unstructured play has profound consequences, particularly during puberty, which brings us to another crucial point.
Okay.
Puberty is this time of significant brain development and social learning, and traditionally it was marked by these rites of passage.
Like rituals and ceremonies.
Yeah, rituals and ceremonies acknowledging the transition to adulthood.
You know, think of like vision quests or coming of age ceremonies. They provided this structured way for young people to test their limits, face challenges, and be recognized as adults by their community.
Exactly. But without those clear markers of adulthood in modern society, adolescence can feel like this extended period of uncertainty. Kids are bombarded with the complexities of adult life online, but they lack the real-world experience to navigate them.
Like they're stuck in this in-between,
Yeah.
this digital no man's land.
Yes.
Not quite children, but not fully adults either.
And this is where Haidt's argument gets even more compelling. He suggests that this new phone-based childhood, combined with the decline in free play and rites of passage, has led to what he calls the 4 foundational harms of childhood.
Okay, so let's unpack these 4 foundational harms.
Okay.
The first one, social deprivation, is pretty intuitive, right?
It is. It's not that teenagers are completely isolated. They're constantly connected online, but the quality of their social interactions is fundamentally different.
Yeah.
Take a look at figure 2.1 in the book. The decline in face-to-face interaction is startling, even when teens are physically together.
Yeah, and that's not even considering how smartphones themselves interrupt conversations.
Right.
You know, it's like we're all constantly checking notifications, feeling this pressure to be available 24/7, and it creates this barrier to genuine connection.
Precisely. Yeah. Smartphones create a real barrier to intimacy.
Yeah.
Those deeper, meaningful conversations that are so crucial for strong relationships are becoming less and less common.
Okay, the second harm is sleep deprivation,
Yes.
which I'm sure most of us can relate to.
Yeah.
But for teens, whose brains are still developing, it's particularly concerning.
You're right. Teenagers need a lot of sleep, and screens disrupt their sleep patterns in a number of ways. The blue light that's emitted from our devices, it suppresses melatonin production,
Right.
which disrupts our natural sleep cycle.
And then there's the simple fact that, you know, social media and online activities are so engaging, it's hard to resist staying up late scrolling or gaming.
Oh, it's true.
Right.
And the consequences of sleep deprivation are significant, impacting everything from mental and physical health to academic performance.
It's a vicious cycle. When you're sleep deprived, you're more irritable, less focused, which makes it harder to learn, which creates more stress,
Right.
exacerbating the problem.
It is.
Now, the third harm, attention fragmentation.
Yes.
This one hit me hard. It's like we're living in Kurt Vonnegut's short story, Harrison Bergeron.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember those attention handicaps they had to wear
Yes.
to prevent people with high IQs from focusing too long? Our smartphone notifications are like our own personal attention handicaps.
Exactly. We're constantly bombarded with pings, alerts, and updates that pull us away from whatever we're trying to focus on. And this constant distraction has real consequences for our ability to concentrate, think deeply, just be present in the moment.
Okay. And finally, the fourth harm, which is a big one, addiction.
Yes.
This is where social media companies really excel, unfortunately.
They've become masters at exploiting our dopamine reward system. Those likes, comments, notifications, they trigger those dopamine releases, making us feel good and keeping us coming back for more.
The book includes this really powerful quote from Sean Parker, Facebook's first president.
Oh, yeah.
He admits that they knew they were exploiting human psychology, and he even said something like, God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains.
It's a chilling admission.
It's a chilling admission. It makes you really think about the long-term impact of all of this.
It does.
So we've explored these 4 foundational harms.
Yes.
Social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction.
Right.
I'm curious to know how these harms might be playing out differently for girls and boys.
That's a great question, and something Haidt explores in detail. Girls and boys are experiencing the impacts of technology and social media in distinct ways.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a break and we'll come back and talk about that.
Sounds good. One of the most significant challenges girls face is this constant pressure to present this perfect image online.
Yeah.
It's all about these carefully curated photos and filters, creating this illusion of a flawless life. And this can be incredibly damaging to a young girl's self-esteem, especially during those vulnerable adolescent years.
Makes sense, yeah. I can see how this constant pursuit of likes and validation online could make girls start to view their real life as a performance.
Right.
And lead to like this chronic insecurity and anxiety about how they measure up.
Exactly. Girls are constantly bombarded with these images of what they should look like and how they should be living their lives, which just fuels social comparison, body image issues, and anxiety. It's like this never-ending competition for online approval.
And I remember the book also talked about how negative emotions like depression can spread more easily through female friendships.
Yeah.
What was that called?
Emotional contagion.
Huh.
Think about a group of friends where one girl's constantly anxious about her online image or comparing herself to others. That anxiety can be contagious, spreading to her friends and creating this cycle of negativity.
Oh, that's interesting. It's like those negative emotions become amplified within those close-knit female friendships.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I understand, this dynamic doesn't seem to play out in the same way with boys.
Right.
Right.
The book also delves into the role of social media in the rising rates of gender dysphoria among natal females in Gen Z.
Okay.
It's a complex issue, but Haidt suggests that social media might be contributing to this trend in a few ways.
Okay, I'd like to hear more about this.
Well, for one, social media exposes girls to a lot of content that promotes gender nonconformity and challenges traditional ideas about gender roles. And this can create a sense of uncertainty for girls who are already trying to figure out their identities during adolescence.
So it's like adding another layer of complexity to an already complicated stage of life.
Exactly. Social media also provides a platform for girls to connect with others who identify as transgender or gender nonconforming.
Okay.
And while these online communities can offer support and a sense of belonging, they might also influence some girls to question their own gender identity.
So while those online connections can be positive in some ways, they could also lead to more confusion for some girls who are still figuring things out.
Right.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears and talk about how boys are being impacted by this phone-based childhood.
I'm interested to hear more about that. I remember the book talked about how boys tend to be drawn to video games and pornography, while girls gravitate more towards social media. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, and while excessive gaming and pornography use definitely have their own risks, the impact on boys seems to manifest differently than it does for girls.
So instead of that sharp increase in anxiety and depression we see in girls, boys are experiencing more of this gradual decline in real-world engagement, achievement, and well-being.
Right, it's like they're slowly withdrawing from the real world and retreating into this virtual one.
Oh, yeah.
Haidt uses this term failure to launch to describe this trend.
It's like they're getting stuck in a state of perpetual adolescence.
Yeah.
Right. Not engaging in the activities, pursuing the goals, taking on the responsibilities that typically mark that transition to adulthood.
Right. And this is where research by Richard Reeves on the decline of boys and men becomes really relevant. He's found some pretty alarming trends in terms of boys falling behind girls in education at nearly every level.
Yeah, Reeves' work is really eye-opening.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how for decades, girls faced these systemic barriers in education and the workforce. But now the tables have turned, and boys are the ones struggling.
It's a complex issue, but Haidt suggests that boys' disengagement from the real world might be a contributing factor. They're spending more time in front of screens and less time interacting with others, developing those crucial social skills and pursuing real-world goals.
And then there's the issue of easy access to pornography, which can have a real impact on boys developing sexuality and their relationships with real-world partners.
That's a really important point. The book discusses how pornography can create these unrealistic expectations, distort views of intimacy, and even contribute to difficulties in forming healthy relationships later on.
He talked about how pornography essentially separates the evolved lure of sexual pleasure from its natural reward, which is a real-world sexual relationship.
Exactly. Boys can get caught in this cycle of seeking the dopamine hit from pornography,
Right.
but it doesn't fulfill their deeper need for connection and intimacy.
So we've explored the psychological and social impacts of this phone-based childhood for both girls and boys.
Mm-hmm.
I'm ready to move on to the next layer of Haidt's argument. He goes beyond the psychological and social impacts and delves into something even deeper, the spiritual consequences of this shift.
Okay.
This is where it gets really interesting for me.
I agree. This is one of the most thought-provoking aspects of the book. Haidt argues that this phone-based life can actually lead to a kind of spiritual degradation because it hinders those traditional practices that have helped humans connect to something bigger than themselves for centuries.
We're talking about things like shared sacredness, embodiment, stillness, silence, focus.
Right.
Those practices that are common across so many spiritual traditions.
Exactly. They're about finding meaning, purpose, and connection that transcends the individual self. But the phone-based life makes it incredibly difficult to engage in these practices.
It's like we're drowning in the shallow end of the pool.
Right.
And constantly missing out on the depths of experience that lie beneath the surface.
That's a great way to put it. The virtual world with its constant noise and stimulation makes it hard to experience the stillness, silence, and focus that are essential for spiritual growth and a sense of connection to something beyond ourselves.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground exploring these harms of a phone-based childhood and even the spiritual implications. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And it can feel pretty overwhelming.
It can.
To be honest, like where do we even begin to tackle such a complex problem? Thankfully, Haidt doesn't just leave us with doom and gloom.
Right.
He offers some solutions, right?
He does. And he starts by acknowledging that we're dealing with what social scientists call collective action problems.
Collective action problems. I'm not familiar with that term. What does that mean?
Okay, so imagine a group of fishermen. They're all fishing from the same pond.
Okay.
If each fisherman acts in their own self-interest, trying to catch as many fish as possible, it might end up depleting the fish population and ruining the pond for everyone.
So it's like a situation where individual actions, while seemingly rational on their own, can lead to a negative outcome for the whole group.
Exactly. And that's sadly what's happened with the phone-based childhood. It's become this massive collective action problem.
So how does this concept of a collective action problem apply to kids and technology?
Well, think about the pressure kids face to have the latest phone or to be on all the social media platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they recognize the downsides, they don't want to be left out or seen as different.
It's like a social arms race.
Yes.
No one wants to be the first one to disarm.
Right.
Even if everyone would be better off
Exactly.
in the long run.
And it's not just the kids. Parents are trapped in this collective action problem too. They see other families giving their kids smartphones, allowing unlimited screen time, and they worry that if they set stricter limits, their kids will be ostracized or miss out socially.
It's that fear of going against the grain, even when you know
Right.
it might not be in the best interest of your child.
Yeah.
So given these collective action problems, what can we actually do to address this issue?
Well, Haidt, along with Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids,
Oh, yeah.
they propose this multi-pronged approach. They believe we need action from governments, tech companies, schools, and of course, parents.
So let's start with government. What kind of policies could help shift the tide here?
Well, one of the most crucial steps is government regulation of social media companies.
Okay.
Haidt believes we need stronger age verification measures to prevent children from accessing platforms that are designed for adults.
Yeah, it's far too easy for kids to lie about their age
It is.
and create accounts on platforms they're not developmentally ready for.
Yep, a widespread problem.
Yeah.
He also proposes something called a duty of care, which would legally require social media companies to prioritize the well-being of minors using their platforms.
So instead of just focusing on maximizing user engagement and profits,
Right.
they would have to take proactive steps to protect kids from the harms we've been discussing.
It's similar to like safety regulations for toys or car seats.
Okay.
We recognize that children need extra protections, and those protections should extend to the digital world as well.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
What else? He's also a strong advocate for phone-free schools.
Phone-free schools, interesting.
Yeah.
I can imagine some pushback on that one.
Oh, for sure.
What's the rationale there?
Well, the research is pretty clear that smartphones are a major distraction in the classroom. Even when they're not actively being used, they just create this constant temptation
Yeah.
that pulls kids away from their studies.
It's like having this flashing neon sign in the corner of your eye.
Right.
When you're trying to concentrate, it's hard to resist.
Exactly. And it's not just about academic performance. Haidt argues that phone-free schools would promote more social interaction and just create a better environment for learning and connecting with peers.
Makes sense. It's about shifting the focus back to that real-world engagement,
Right.
those face-to-face conversations.
Exactly.
So we talked about regulating social media companies and phone-free schools. Anything else governments could do?
Well, he and Skenazy also believe that we need to change the way we think about child neglect.
Okay. How does that tie into this issue?
So in recent decades, there's been this trend towards overprotective parenting. Kids are constantly supervised.
Right.
They're rarely allowed to play unsupervised.
I see what you're getting at. You're saying he's arguing this overprotection is actually a form of neglect,
Exactly.
neglecting the child's need for independence, for risk-taking, for developing that anti-fragility.
Right. And in some cases, laws actually reinforce this overprotection, making parents afraid to give their kids even a little bit of freedom for fear of being reported for neglect.
That's a really interesting perspective. So what's the solution?
They advocate for reasonable childhood independence laws. These laws would clarify the definition of neglect
Okay.
and protect parents who choose to give their kids age-appropriate independence.
So it's about creating a legal framework that supports
Yes.
rather than punishes parents who want to raise free-range kids.
Precisely. So we've talked about the role of government, but what about the tech companies themselves?
Yeah, they're the ones creating these addictive platforms in the first place, right?
Yeah, right. Well, Haidt argues that tech companies have a responsibility to make their products safer for kids.
Oh.
This means developing better age verification systems and features that allow parents to customize their children's online experiences.
So things like giving parents the ability to limit screen time, block certain types of content, disable notifications during certain hours.
Exactly. It's about giving parents more control and making it easier to set healthy boundaries around technology use.
Yeah.
He also believes that tech companies need to be more transparent about how their algorithms work and how they're designed to keep users engaged, sometimes to the point of addiction.
It's about lifting the veil and helping users understand the psychological tactics being used to keep them hooked.
Right.
Now let's talk about what schools can do. We've already touched on phone-free schools, but what other strategies can they implement?
Well, he and Skenazy are big proponents of bringing back free play. They believe that schools should prioritize recess, outdoor play, and just unstructured time where kids can just be kids and engage in those spontaneous, imaginative, sometimes even risky activities that are so crucial for development.
Creating space for kids to be kids. I love that.
Yeah, and beyond just simply providing time for play, they also advocate for programs like the Let Grow Project, which encourages kids to try new things and take on age-appropriate challenges outside of school.
So extending that free-range philosophy
Yes.
beyond the classroom walls.
And finally, let's talk about what parents can do. At the end of the day, parents have a huge influence on their children's relationship with technology.
It's tough though. Technology's everywhere. It's hard to know where to draw the line.
It is. Well, Haidt offers a lot of practical advice, but one of his key messages is be a gardener, not a carpenter.
I love that analogy. What does that mean?
Okay, so a carpenter tries to shape wood into a specific predetermined form.
Okay.
But a gardener, they create the right conditions for a plant to flourish and grow in its own unique way.
So instead of trying to micromanage every aspect of their child's life, parents should focus on creating an environment that supports healthy development and allows for exploration and growth.
Exactly. That means setting clear limits around technology use, encouraging free play and outdoor activities, fostering real-world social connections, and modeling healthy tech habits themselves.
Finding that balance between protecting kids from harm and giving them the freedom to explore, take risks, and learn from their mistakes.
Yes, and being a good role model in terms of how we use technology ourselves.
That's a good reminder for me.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the anxious generation, what's the biggest takeaway you hope listeners will walk away with?
I think it's crucial to understand the profound impact of the Great Rewiring on Gen Z,
Mhm.
and recognize that the shift from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood has created new vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And it's not just Gen Z. This is a collective problem that's affecting all of us, regardless of our age.
We're all living in this increasingly digital world, and it's changing us in ways we're only just beginning to grasp.
But the good news is that we're not powerless to change course.
Absolutely.
There are steps we can take, both individually and collectively, to bring childhood back down to earth.
Love it.
It starts with awareness, recognizing the potential harms of excessive technology use, remembering the importance of those real-world experiences that foster resilience, connection, and well-being.
And then taking action.
Yes.
Whether it's advocating for policy changes, setting boundaries in our own homes, or just putting down our phones and engaging with the world around us.
Exactly.
I appreciate Haidt's reminder that change is possible, but it requires a conscious effort.
He leaves us with this thought-provoking question. What one small step can you take today to promote a more play-based, less phone-based childhood for yourself or the young people in your life?
That's a powerful question, and one we should all take to heart. Until next time, fellow deep divers, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.